There are more than 100 unique styles of beer, each with their own set of ingredients, process, guidelines, history, and experience. If you're a beer lover, an industry leader, or somewhere in between, a better knowledge of beer style will improve your life and your work.
Welcome to A Sense of Beer Style, essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. I'm Julia Herz.
And I'm Jeremy Storton.
We're advanced Cicerones, beer judges, home brewers, and we're excited to guide you through the vast and wonderful world of beer styles.
I will just do higher level on flavor components. To me, off flavors is a misnomer, and I even correct myself as such earlier in this show. Flavor components is better to say because sometimes you will have flavors that are considered off flavors in certain beer styles, but acceptable in others at lower levels. So I like flavor components. Again, this is the document that I created with the work of amazing team at craftbeer.com and the Brewers Association when I was studying for Master Cicerone. What I wanted to point out here for those actually visibly able to see it, and if not, you can Google craftbeer.com flavor components, and it'll bring you to the sheet, is the categories. So you have acids that will bring you certain flavors. You have carbonyl compounds. You have esters, as Jeremy was talking about. You have phenols. You have sodium. You have different categories of sulfur. That was a huge one on Master, was talking to me about sulfur, and there's so many different types of compounds. I document a few here. And then you have taints that, can be like ferrous sulfate, which is like metallic. E2-nonanol is a taint. It's oxidation, which is very common in many beers. And then vicinal diketones, if I say that right, are, a combination of things, but really bring forth diacetyl in beer, which is really common in some beers, strategic, in others not intended at all. So those are kind of some of the groups when we talk about flavor components that others might refer to as off flavors. And the studying and the way to get to know those is endless.
Yes, and I think it's important to know that all of those flavor components, some people call them off flavors, like you mentioned, they come from different places and even from multiple different places. For example, you had vanillin typically comes from barrels. If you have something like sulfur, actually different sulfurs can come from the grains. Some sulfurs can come from hops. Some sulfurs can come from the water. Some sulfurs can come from yeast. It's understanding what you taste and paying attention to, I'm tasting something different. Does it taste like cream corn? Does it taste like a boiled egg? Does it taste like a struck match? We kind of talked about the better you can add specificity to your vocabulary, the better you're going to be able to figure out what it is and where it came from, if that's important to you. But it's important to know that some of these flavors can come from a lot of different places.
Absolutely.
Yep.
We'll move on to water now, getting into the flavors of beer. And Jeremy, you're definitely going to round me out on this one. And we certainly talk in depth in one of the Prepisodes on water and its ingredients, how water affects pH, titratable acidity, which the wine world talks about a lot. But what we're after really today is kind of water chemistry and what the flavors delivered from water are. And a lot of people group different water geographies to different beer styles that are indicative of the water in those geographies. The London, Dublin, Germany, high calcium carbonate style water will give, dark malty beer flavors and a temporary hardness that precipitates out when heated. High carbonate can make hops be waxy and unpleasant. So that's something to keep in mind for the London, Dublin, Germany style beers. Burton-on-Trent out of the UK, for example, very well known for high calcium sulfate, aka gypsum, accentuates hoppy beers and definitely brings forth permanent hardness. And I love the concept of that brewers all over the world, when they brew a beer style that's a traditional classic beer style, they're also often mimicking the water profile from that region to really bring forth what the beer style is supposed to taste like. So when you talk about water, you've got all of these compounds. Chloride, a component of table salt, is a mineral and very, very commonly considered when brewing. Calcium, very commonly considered when brewing. and each of these things do very specific things. Calcium can, help acidify the mash, and coaxes alpha amylase, one of the enzymes, to do better when it's breaking down starch to sugar. There's lots to really riff on the C's: carbonate, calcium, and the like, and chlorophenols, which is sometimes a reaction to chlorine-based sanitizers, like bleach, will affect the flavor of your beer, and give you an essence of phenol that can be very band-aidy or very chlorine-y, like swimming pool, and the like. So there is a little bit of a higher level hit on the very geeky, complex notion of the water topic. What else you got to add to that, Jeremy?
We talked about before we started recording, this is a very heady topic, and there's a lot of stuff that most people don't really need to know. I mean, brewers need to know this stuff. Home brewers love to know this stuff. There's a lot of chemistry, and so if it's not important to you, the things that I think are important, because I'm not into the chemistry of it all, and the science of it all goes further than I want to go. But the things to understand, you mentioned chlorine. That is something that is typically added into municipal water to keep it sanitary and safe to drink right out of the faucet. But like you said, if we brew with that water, we're going to get Band-Aid, plastic bucket, and old school Listerine type flavors out of it. If you use a really, really hard water with a permanent hardness that will not precipitate out with boiling, it's possible to get a little bit of minerally character out of it, or a fullness. Even just, you can play with this at home and use fresh, pure water, and use just a tiny, tiny little pinch of ordinary table salt, and you'll get a fullness. You'll get almost like a sweetness. You add a little bit more, it gets a little bit briny. You add a little bit more, now it's salty. That's kind of fun to play with from the sense of the mouthfeel and the flavor expression. And water does kind of the same things. Sulfates can come through in water, and next thing you know, you're tasting some weird stuff. You can't get rid of this because it came through in the water. Different ways to deal with the water is you can filter it, you can reverse osmosis it. There's different things that you can do to allow talented brewers to basically recreate the water profile of their choice. The bottom line that I want everyone to understand is just the way the chemistry, the alkalinity, the acidity, and the minerality of the water can bring different aspects of your malt, your hops, and your yeast into and out of focus when it comes to flavor. Whether you memorize any of the chemistry, it doesn't matter. Just understand that water is going to basically dictate how that beer is going to come through. And it's amazing.
I love everything you just rounded out. And that kind of covers some of the main components for flavors, or the main influencers for flavors that you might get in beer. So Jeremy, let's talk about and kind of bring everyone home on listening. Like, where do they use this information? Where do you think is the best place to get this information and the like?
Well, a lot of this information that I've gotten were from resources that you created at craftbeer.com. They've really helped me out tremendously, like the one you just showed. There's a few books out as well on malt, hops, yeast, water, but that's really higher level knowledge. One of my favorite resources just to get a overall breadth of all this stuff is really Tasting Beer by Randy Mosher. To me, that was ground zero on getting just kind of a complete, thorough lay of the land before I took it into beer nerd town. That was a great spot. So it depends on why you need to know the stuff. If you're a brewer, then you're going to have to go higher level. If you're a distributor or a sales rep or a bartender, then just having an appreciation for this stuff, I think is going to be helpful. And it's kind of fun. Talk to the brewers. Why does it taste like this? Why does it taste like that? I think brewers like to do that too, because they want to know, did I get it right? Do I need to go back to the drawing board? If I answered your question, I think I answered your question. What else do you want to add to that?
Just that everyone's going to populate their own list. There is no one magic bullet place that everyone points to, is I think some of what Jeremy's bringing up. And a lot of the more prolific resources will take you down the rabbit hole as you start to dive deeper. Or you can just get a base if you're, listening to this in your tableside server and just want a better grounding on how to describe flavors from the main ingredients in beer. But I'm pretty pleased as punch to one day do a prep episode on every single topic that we just discussed
Yeah.
in terms of ingredients in beer, and making them lengthy and really diving in. So let's
Well,
look forward to that.
well, I do have to say, if you do want to dive in a little bit deeper, you can go listen to another great podcast called Good Beer Matters. I happen to know that there's quite a bit of information on the subject there and available. But do we want to talk about some of the common off flavors, quote unquote, at all, just to kind of touch feet on those bases?
Go for it. Lead us through.
Okay. There's a lot of different flavors, unintended flavors, off flavors that we can discuss. Just a few of the big ones that we should talk about would be, the first one on our list is oxidation. That's when air kind of has its way with the beer, sits on a warm shelf for way too long. This typically is not a problem with packaging. This is typically a problem in the brewing process with splashing all that hot wort and getting all that oxygen pickup at that time. But the way that it comes across, if you taste especially an older beer, maybe even an imported beer, and you get the sense of like wet cardboard or wet paper, that is how oxidation manifests in a beer.
And it's definitely a chemical reaction. If you've ever cut an apple open and then it sits out in the open air and you start to see it almost patina or oxidize with that red rusty color on the apple flesh, that's the active oxidation happening right in front of you. And it will not only be a visible change, but it also is a chemical change enough to then taste the change because of the influence of oxygen.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the next one on our list, diacetyl?
You go ahead, Jeremy. I will bring it home after.
Oh, great, perfect.
You set it up.
Diacetyl. This is one of those that I don't particularly dislike all that much. I actually kind of enjoy it, but in small amounts, it's okay to have in like a Czech Pilsner, for example, or in some British milds, because that's just the way that the yeast manifests, and that's been part of it. But but the way that diacetyl comes across is almost like a movie theater popcorn butter. And you certainly don't want your beer to taste like butter. But if you imagine a good Czech Pilsner, it almost tastes like, we talked about malt before and tastes like bread. Imagine fresh rolls coming out of the oven and they're lightly buttered. That is what a good Czech Pilsner should taste like. So having diacetyl, in very small, lower intensity amounts is actually, for me, kind of a nice thing. If there's too much intensity, then it's a different thing. But that can manifest in butter. It can manifest in honey. It can manifest in butterscotch when it gets really strong. Again, just understanding, but this is a process where the yeast creates this in the fermentation process and then goes back through to clean it up afterwards. And so if there's a lot of diacetyl in the beer, there's a good chance that it did not have enough time to finish fermenting completely through, or possibly there's somewhat of a infection in the lines and it's just coming across as more of like a diacetyl type of flavor. Anything you want to add?
And Jeremy, what I love you brought up here with diacetyl, or some people say diacetyl, is that in some beer styles it is acceptable. The Bohemian or Czech style pills, absolutely at low levels. Sam Adams Boston Lager has a discerning and deliberate behind the scenes bump of mouthfeel from the diacetyl. And it'll give, I think, to me, a little bit more malt flavor. On one of my favorite beers is Sam Adams Boston Lager.
Yeah.
So it can also influence the mouthfeel, give your sense of slickness on the tongue. So that's to pay attention to. But at high levels, when it's going, beyond that low level buttery richness, but to buttered popcorn, it is undesirable. Also to note, it can come from bacteria, Pediococcus. It's not just coming from Saccharomyces yeast. And Jeremy described it beautifully, where the yeast just has not been given enough time to ferment and scavenge and remove back the diacetyl that occurs. And a lot of lagers, they'll deliberately do a diacetyl rest so that the yeast itself has time to reabsorb the diacetyl that it produced during fermentation.
Yeah. And there's a long list of these. We could go on. Again, it could be its own podcast. Just one last one. Acetaldehyde is another one that comes through typically in the fermentation process. And again, if you give the yeast enough time to go back through and scrub it out, particularly in lagers, which are colder fermented and slower, they just need time. There are some breweries try and kick a lager out in a couple weeks, and the traditional ones will kick it out after a few months. Taste the beer, but the way that taste the beer and decide if it's ready or not, because it may not be ready. The way that acetaldehyde manifests for me is it can come through as almost like a green Granny Smith apple, not a red apple, not a red delicious apple, but a green Granny Smith apple. And it can also come through as a little bit of like raw pumpkin, maybe like starting to get a little latexy. But that's where it just doesn't taste quite right. It's not the worst off flavor I've ever tasted, but it is not supposed to be there. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, well described. It basically means green beer packaged too early, or high fermentation temperatures that should have been controlled.
Mm-hmm. Yep. But we'll dive into the other 1,000 off flavors another time. Were there any other resources you wanted to share?
I'm good. I
You're
think
good?
it's been a great, empowering episode. Go
Yep.
forth and conquer. Read, review, read again, and then taste, because that's the whole point. Test each other. Blind tastings with off-flavor kits is also a really good one to know and talk about quickly. You can either get group buy-in to share one, so the cost is lower. And then you also have people helping serve the beer, so you're serving yourself blind or others blind, so you're not aware of what's being dosed into a base beer. But off-flavor kits are really helpful if you're testing, or if you want to calibrate to what one specific off-flavor is specifically concentrated in concentrated levels.
Excellent point. If you're going after BJCP beer judge certification, and especially certified Cicerone or above, these are going to be critical.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right.
Awesome. Well, it was wonderful talking about beer flavor with you again. Let's talk next time.
Cheers to everybody. Thanks for listening.
All right. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to A Sense of Beer Style, the essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. With advanced Cicerones, me, Julia,
And me, Jeremy.
Tune into the next episode as we continue exploring the world of beer styles and what to make of them. We encourage you to listen to the Prepisodes to build your foundation and better understand beer styles.
And before the next episode, I'd like to ask you to review the show and let us know what you'd like featured in upcoming episodes. Until next time, here's to you and your sense of beer style. Thank you for listening. Cheers.